All right, let's dive into something wild. Today, we're going to tackle a really mind-bending idea. What if you could use the actual laws of quantum physics to create a totally new kind of digital money? I know, it sounds out there, but stick with me, because this is going to be a fascinating ride.
So let me just ask you this straight up. Imagine this, a tiny microscopic crystal, just blinking, on, off, on, off. What if that tiny little blink could be the foundation for a whole new kind of money? Sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, right? Well, that's exactly the idea we're going to unpack today.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to dive into the quantum world. Then we'll talk about the physics of losing information. After that, we'll connect it all to money itself. We'll meet the key players, the data valuer, and this thing called USSDS. And finally, we'll see how the whole TQFD system ties it all together. It's a journey, but we'll take it step by step. All right, first up, the blinking quantum world. And to get our heads around this whole economic theory, we have to start small. And when I say small, I mean really, really small. We're going all the way down to the nanoscale, because that's where this entire idea is built from. So the bedrock of this whole thing? It's something called quantum dots. The easiest way to think about them is like artificial atoms. They're these teeny tiny semiconductor crystals, so small that the weird rules of quantum mechanics take over. And the cool part? This isn't just theory. These are real things, physical objects that scientists are working with in labs right now. So, okay, what's so special about these quantum dots? Simple, they blink. You hit them with a laser, they absorb that energy, and poof, they light up. But then, for no obvious reason, they'll just switch off, go dark. Then they'll pop back on again, off again. It looks totally random, right? But here's the kicker. That blinking isn't just random noise. It's actually a super rich signal, packed with information about energy and, disorder right inside that tiny little system. And that blinking, that disorder we just talked about, well, it's not just a quirk. It's a direct window into one of the most fundamental concepts in all of physics, which brings us right to our next section, the physics of losing information. Or, to put it more simply, we need to talk about entropy. So what in the world is entropy? You've probably heard it described as disorder or chaos. But for what we're talking about today, a much better way to think of it is as information loss. The universe just kind of trends towards messiness. Think about an ice cube melting into a puddle. You can't just unmelt it, right? That process can't be reversed. That's entropy. And in that process, you've fundamentally lost the information about the ice cube's original, perfect, ordered shape.
Okay, this next part is super, super important. We need to talk about memory. See, most simple systems are what we call Markovian. It's a fancy word that just means they're memoryless. What happens next only depends on what's happening right now. The past is totally irrelevant. But quantum dots are different. They're non-Markovian. They do have a memory. What they did in the past actually influences what they'll do in the future. And that memory is the whole key here, because you can think of it like a transaction history, a record that actually holds on to value.
All right, you've been patient, we've talked about blinking crystals, we've talked about physics and entropy. Now it's time to make the big leap. Let's build a bridge from all that science directly to economics. This is where the whole thing really starts to click. Okay, so just to recap that core idea from physics, right? Any system, if you just leave it alone, will start to break down and lose information. Simple. That's entropy. And now for the big aha moment. This new economic model says, what if money behaves just like a physical system? Because if it does, that means it also suffers from its own kind of entropy. It naturally loses its value, its utility, its information over time. I mean, just think about inflation, right? That's it. That's economic entropy in action. And that is the exact problem this whole idea is designed to fix. So if money naturally degrades, how do you fight that? Well, the guy who came up with this, Felipe Alves Ferreira, has this great metaphor. He says you need to be placing monetary potatoes in your own land. I love that. The idea is you don't just stuff your money under a mattress and let it rot, You have to actively cultivate it. You have to work it, tend to it, to preserve its value, instead of just watching it wither away. Okay, so if we're farming these monetary potatoes, that brings up two questions. Who's the farmer and what's the crop? That brings us to the data valuer and USD. Let's meet our farmer, the data valuer. Now, this isn't your typical passive investor. Nope. This is a new kind of economic agent, a really active one. Their job is to take raw data about money and use it as a raw material. They team up with a super advanced AI, and together, their whole mission is to fight that economic entropy we talked about. They do this thing called money data valuation, and the end result is a totally new digital asset.
And that new asset? It's called UUSS, which stands for Universal Social Dollars. And this is really important. You don't just buy UUSS. It has to be created. It's generated through a process they call valorization. It's basically the act of the data value where capturing the informational value of money, the part that's usually lost to that pesky entropy, and by saving it, they actually create something the theory calls more value.
Okay, so at this point, you're probably thinking, how does a blinking quantum dot in a lab connect to a stabilized digital dollar, right? It's a fair question. Well, our final section is going to put all the puzzle pieces together and explain the whole system. The whole thing is held together by something called the TQFD system. It's a mouthful, I know. It stands for Thermodynamic Quantum Financial Data. But just think of it as the engine, or the operating system that translates the laws of physics, those same laws governing the blinking of that quantum dot, into a working set of rules for digital finance. So here's how it's made in 4 basic steps. First, you capture the data. Sensors detect the flow of regular old money. Step 2, process. The AI gets to work measuring how fast that money is losing value. It's measuring the economic entropy. Step 3, valorize. This is where the human data valuer jumps in. Using special tools, they actively fight that entropy and create the US dollars. And finally, step 4, store. That new stabilized US dollar is kept safe and sound in something called the Webcache Universal Web.
And that brings us full circle, right back to a big question. Is this a real blueprint for how we'll think about value in the future? Or is it just a really, really cool thought experiment that makes us question what money even is? Either way you look at it, it's a powerful idea that maybe value, just like energy, is another fundamental part of the universe. It's a lot to think about.